Thank you so much. All right. Good evening, good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, depending on where you're joining us from. It's such a pleasure to be joining you again for the second edition of our webinar for the month of October. And yes, as we started 2 weeks ago, we are all about leadership governance. And this month is about the Black History Month, about national development. And we are talking about the role of the diaspora in building nations across the continent. I'm excited to be here. Just as we usually will do, please let us know where you're joining from. You can drop that in the comment box. We really appreciate you joining us this evening. In the meantime, my name is Seyi Adisa, and this is the African Governance Institute for Development, and we are all about governance, leadership, and national development. We are going to be talking about reclaiming roots, shaping futures, the African diaspora's role in nation building. As you know, I always love to start with some statistics, and more so I have professors in our midst this evening, so I try and do some justice to that. Some figures we saw online. According to the World Economic Forum 2024, more than 200 million people of African descent live outside the continent and will soon make up over 25% of the global population. In 2019, Ghana's government launched a campaign tagged the Year of the Return, and we saw over 1 million African diasporans come to visit, invest, and even permanently reside in Ghana. Nearly 3 in 5 young Africans said they are either very or somewhat likely to consider emigrating to another country in the next 3 years, according to the African Youth Survey of 2024. And then it goes on and on. The 2024 World Migration Report reveals that since 1990, the number of African migrants living outside of the region has more than doubled, with the growth in Europe most pronounced. In 2020, most African-born migrants live outside the region, were residing in Europe, Asia, and North America. So once again, let us know where you're joining us from. We're in for a very good conversation. I am joined by 2 excellent, not just professors, but people of integrity, people that are nation builders in every right. And I am pleased to introduce and welcome to the platform Professor Lemuel LaRoche, who says he doesn't mind being called Life, but for tonight we'll use Professor LaRoche. And we have Professor Frederick Kumolalo, and we thank you both from the United States, from Georgia and the Maryland axis especially. And very shortly, I'm just going to yield the floor for them to introduce themselves. I have their bios, but I always think it's better they get to introduce themselves and tell us what they are currently up to right now, what they're passionate about, what is strong on their minds right now. And we're in for a great conversation. So welcome everybody once again. Professor LaRoche, I'll yield the floor to you, and please just let us have your introductions, and just tell us what you're currently working on, or what you're very passionate about at this time. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you so much for introducing me, and thank you so much for introducing me to the platform, and just sending the greetings to everyone that is tuning in. And my name is Lemuel LaRoche. I am the executive director for a nonprofit called Chess and Community. I'm also a program director for an organization called Youth Force Innovation Hub, which is a program of the Boys and Girls Club of America, which is a national organization. I teach at the University of Georgia in the School of Social Work. My passion, before I go into the passion, I've been to all, at this point, I can say I've visited all 4 corners of the mother continent. I've been north, I've been south, I've been east. And for the first time in my life, I got an opportunity to visit West Africa, Nigeria. So shout out to my brothers and sisters, all the beautiful spirits that I got a chance to meet and engage with in the Nigeria region. And my passion is youth development. That has always been something I've been on the forefront over the last 25 years, just identifying, helping our youth, one, identifying who they are, but then the second aspect to that is allowing them to recognize some of the resources and opportunities that exist in this area. Primarily, we use critical thinking, conflict resolution, and problem solving as modalities for help youth to develop and come into their leadership. And as of recent, we've developed a partnership with Chess and Slums Africa. Shout out to my brother Tunde, Emmanuel, if they're checking in with Chess and Slums and that entire family. And we've been really working together on how do we build this cross-cultural collaboration, cross-cultural diplomacy. We have a program called Ubuntu that we're launching in 2025, where we'll be bringing students from Nigeria to the US for an engagement with our students. In 2017, we've taken kids from our city, Athens, Georgia, to Ethiopia for 2.5 weeks. So we're really passionate about building those bridges across the continents and allowing our youth to really begin to talk with each other and see how we can really just kind of carve a pathway forward. So this is who I am. I'm excited for this dialogue, and let's go.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor LaRoche. Professor Kumolalo, please, over to you, your introductions, and just tell us what you're passionate or working on currently.
Thank you very much, Honorable Adisa. Am I clear over there?
Yes, you are. Please go ahead.
All right. Thank you for this opportunity and to share the panel with Professor LaRoche. Okay. I find it a bit interesting that he's a social worker. That's one of my caps. Even though I'm an academic historian, I'm also a licensed social worker. And my passion is families and children. So that as a backdrop. Apart from my callings as an academic, I'm also involved in youth development. As a matter of fact, I run an institute here in Maryland. It's called North Elevation Institute. The focus is also on youth development. And currently, focus or vision rather in the coming year, 2025, is to get a footprint in Africa, in Nigeria. I discovered that most youth programs are focused in the urban areas. And I feel, look, people in urban areas are important, and those in the rural areas are important. I was born and raised in the countryside, and I feel it's about time we pay some attention to youth in the countryside who seem disadvantaged when it comes to the issue of being exposed to the opportunities in our world today. So our intention for this very coming year, 2025, is to see to getting a foothold in a rural area in Nigeria as a launching pad to get across to young people in the countryside.
All right. Thank you very much, sir. Now, natural first question is, both of you have spoken about looking at the continents. And maybe the first question is why many people in diaspora, never look back, so to say. What is the motivation behind, always looking back? Now, Professor Kumolalo said when he lived in the countryside and all of that, but it's almost a natural. I know Professor Kumolalo has lived there, 30 years, 40? I don't know how long you've been in the US now, even though you lived in Nigeria at some point. Professor LaRoche has, I'm not sure, probably lived in the US. Why? What is the motivation? What do you see that everybody else needs to see? What is the message? What is the driving force? I'll let Professor LaRoche start, please.
I think for me as a youth, I was instilled, I was rooted in the idea of Sankofa, right? You have to look back to move forward, right? I was a student of a child of Pan-Africanism, right? My fathers and my elders that raised me was about Black liberation. They were all about before you pass, you make sure you touch the mother. You make sure you go back home. You make sure you make that real connection back home. So while we have a lot of real dire issues and concerns, not only in the U.S., but even across the Caribbean. So you're talking about, Jamaica, you're talking about Cuba, you're talking, we have issues of people of diaspora all across, and wherever we are kind of in the lowest part of the totem pole, right? So we are struggling everywhere. But for me, it was always something inside of me that has been called, like my father, I can always still hear him. You got to go back to that. You got to go back, find out who you are, reconnect with your roots. So the idea of going there is one thing, going and taking pictures and being a part of and embracing the culture. And it's an entire different ball game to really begin to align with similar minds and start looking at ways of what are some of the things that we are doing well, not just export the worst part of our cultures to the continent, but also the humanity, the beauty, the things that we are doing well on this side, and see how we can collaborate with a lot of our counterparts on the ground. So whenever I'm on a continent, I'm not coming with I am coming to teach you all. I'm coming to learn, and I'm coming to share. And doing that helped me to even become more effective and to be able to be more engaging in the work that I do on this side. So a lot of it was instilled in me as a child. My roots is both, we're talking the Geechee Gullah folks out of South Carolina. That is a direct link to West Africa. And then the other part of my family, we're talking, Shinnecock, the Native Americans that were here. So it all exists inside of me. And while I understand one part clearly, it was always about reconnecting with another part of myself.
Thank you so much, Professor LaRoche. Especially, I love the fact you talked about coming also to learn, because one of the things we always like to emphasize every time we talk about diaspora, it's almost as if the continent is always in need. It's almost like the continent needs help, but then the continent also has so much to give, and just you really emphasizing that there's so much to take as well. Take from music to culture, there's just so much the continent also offers, and that was really good to share. Professor Kumolalo, over to you, sir.
Yeah,
what
it's
is
all about opportunities. I was born and raised in Nigeria in the countryside, and I would say I was a bit fortunate to be able to come to the United States to work and to live. And in doing that, my eyes got open to the huge opportunities here in the United States that were not quite present back home in Africa, and in this case, Nigeria. And I feel people should work to connect the humans with the opportunity. Not necessarily to come and live in America, but to take, if you would, the best of America. And you don't have to reinvent the wheels. Let's see what works here in the United States and how that can be replicated as far as possible back home in Africa. Our young people, they are as good as any young people anywhere in the world. Oftentimes they are disadvantaged, not only for lack of resources, but for lack of information. I already mentioned the issue of culture. Yeah, you see, our young people, they learn easily when it comes to the issue of culture. But beyond the culture, what else is there to learn? What else is there to borrow from the, if you would, so-called new world, from the to the old? And Africa has been, to a large extent, the butt of bad jokes. The dark continent, the backward continent, Africa rising. Africa is much more than a problem. Africa is a place of tremendous possibilities. But then, if we focus on people my age or older, I think that would be a waste of time. But younger people who have their life ahead of them, who have the strength, the tenacity, the commitment to make the best of opportunities, if they have it, I think that's an area that I really, really want to focus on, whereby young people who otherwise may not have so much opportunity will be connected with the opportunities available in their world because of exposure.
Fantastic, fantastic. Thank you. And that's so important. It's usually not a case of lack of skill. It's just the platform, and why it's so important to continue to create those platforms. I'll go back to you, Professor LaRoche. I was in Trinidad and Tobago in 2017, and we had gone for a cultural program, and we were well received, and I noticed that many, well called diasporans, because they had interest in Africa and the continent, they wanted to connect with their roots, but it seemed they had challenges. It seemed like they were, so you could hear the passion. Oh, I would love to do this. I'd love to go back. And I'm like, okay, so why? So what has been your biggest challenge reconnecting with the continent? What are the challenges? And maybe you can start to talk about how maybe you started to resolve it, because you've been to the 4 parts of Africa: north, south, western, east. So clearly there are challenges, because maybe more people should be doing more and connecting more, and just be, but there are challenges. So what are those challenges you faced and you are aware of, and how did you overcome them?
So I think it's important for us. Great question, by the way. And I think it's important for us to take a step back and clearly understand, how are we introduced to the continent, right? How do we get to learn about the continent? I'm in my 40s, right? So I come from a school of thought where Africa was centralized in my development, right? It was part of our music. It was part of, going back to the motherland. That was rooted in hip hop at the time of my upbringing. I remember when Nelson Mandela, was freed, during the apartheid movement. Like, we were in Brooklyn, downtown Brooklyn, just chanting "Free Mandela." Like, this was my upbringing, right? Now, somewhere along the way, someone else began to define Africa for us, right? Not the Africans itself, but someone else. We have a tube. We have sort of this intermediate between us that allows us to see Africa as what the professor said, the dark continent, a continent of struggle, a continent of poverty, blood diamond, Rwanda, Hotel Rwanda, and nothing but violence. Ethiopia with the big bellies and starvation and malaria and that. So this became our definition, even with us growing up learning about Africa through, through Mali, through various different movements. But we later Africa became a space that we said, whoa, I don't know. If I go there, I need to be safe. And I think the best way to identify that is when I took my first trip to South Africa. We're talking Zimbabwe, the first trip that I really went. I was excited. I was, I'm going to Africa, right? This is me, right? Now, I understand Africa with various different countries. Africa is not one country. It's a landmass of 53 countries, so much rich, different diversity. But I'm excited to go to Africa and have an idea. I have romanticized what Africa was in my mind based on the stories told by my fathers and in the movements and everybody that speaks about Africa and the Pan-African movements. But heading to Nigeria, I started getting flooded with letters. You sure you want to go? Look at this cholera outbreak. Look at this violence that's going on here. Be careful. Even going to Nigeria, be careful. Everybody kept saying, be careful, man. Be careful. Nigeria is dangerous. I said, New York is dangerous. Atlanta is dangerous. It's dangerous all over the world, right? But it zooms in on Africa as when the issue is happening in one little place, it's the entire continent that is going through it. And because of our ignorance of even understanding the geographical location, we sometimes buy into it. But immediately, I saw it differently when I boarded the plane, and I saw nothing but our our white cousins going with their children. And I'm like, hold on. I'm being told I can't go to this continent because of the violence, but I'm on a plane full of white families with their children heading to the same location, right? So there's a set of instructions that come to us that tells us, be careful, don't connect with them. If Africans are coming here, they don't want to rock with you. They don't want to mess with Americans. They don't like Americans. And I'm sure, as I'm hearing from some of my brothers and sisters, they get some of the same stuff. You come over there, don't mess with them. So there is this broken chain that has started to form between our communities. And I think for me to break that was a way for me to go and touch it for the first time and recognizing that what happens in South Africa is completely different from East Africa. What's going on in East Africa is completely different from West Africa, but we still one tree.
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Professor LaRoche. I think my well now 16-year-old cousin, but at the time she was or niece, I beg your pardon, she was 14. And when they told her she was coming to Nigeria, she was like, oh my gosh. I said, Uncle, are we going to see lions on the streets and we're going to see elephants? And I couldn't believe, I thought those were things in the movies, but then it takes you to who's telling the story, and the role of the media in literally, because when the story is told, it doesn't matter who is listening. Even Africans in diaspora are also listening, second generation, third generation, and their mindset of the continent are being formed, and that is really affecting the opportunity that could be created. So just very quickly, as an interlude, we're going to start taking questions about 7:45. We have two professors with us here, and I'm sure they will also love to hear from you, not just myself. So if you have questions, start putting them in the comment box and we will take them when the time is right. Now, Professor Kumolalo, I want to come to you, sir. So how do we leverage the international experience for Africa's development? How do we do it? Because I hear a lot of brain drain. We're losing talent, we're losing, and especially if you're not second or third generation. If you're first generation, you've come to America, they call it the land of opportunities, or Europe, or wherever you go to. How do we leverage this international experience for Africa's development? How do we make it happen?
Thank you very much. Let's start from where the prof left off on the issue of perception. It's not just an immediate issue. The system here, Americans could be very, very brilliant, phenomenal, but some could be very, very ignorant also. Yeah. The kids in public schools are given the wrong impression about the continent. I know somebody who brought in two kids from Africa. Perhaps one was 7 years old, the other was 5. They got to school here, and after 1 or 2 years, they were coming to say, well, the Africa is a jungle. Yeah. And their dad asked, did you live in a jungle when I brought from Africa? Were you born into a jungle? Did you play in a jungle? Did you school in a jungle? So even kids who actually experienced Africa when they were very young, gradually they were socialized into beginning to think about the continent negatively. So not just a media thing, but the system of education here also perpetuates those ideas about Africa. That's it. So to your question about how we can leverage the talent here for development back home. Now I use the word home advisedly. I see myself as an African. So when I say home, I mean Africa. Now, number one, there's a need to be very intentional about it. Absolutely intentional. One of the greatest stories of success of the diaspora will be India. And the India government over time has been very, very intentional in creating not just policies, but an environment that enabled collaboration that would maximize the talent that India has in the diaspora. In this case, focusing on North America. So, African governments must be intentional in putting in place policies that will make it not easy, but easier for Africans on the diaspora, either those who are born on the continent or those who are just passionate about the continent, to want to come back to Africa to either invest their money or invest their talents and mental abilities. That's one. Secondly, the issue of security is very important. And Mara was saying that it was told, Nigeria is dangerous. Yeah. Nigeria is no more dangerous than Chicago or New York. However, we cannot ignore the issue of security, especially in countries like Nigeria, like Ethiopia, like Kenya, and to a lesser extent, like Liberia. And so there must be that need, that effort at ensuring some decent architecture of security that will make life easier to live without looking at your back at all times. And then, much more importantly, there's the need to also, if you would, let folks at home understand that the diaspora is not a competition but a collaborator. Oftentimes, people at home in Africa, and in this case, Nigeria, sees somebody coming from outside as, oh, you've eaten over there. Why are you coming to want to come and eat over here? The person was trying to come home, if you would, isn't about eating. He or she actually wants to make a small difference. Granted that some diasporans also have this idea like they're not in shining armor, they're coming home to rescue Africa. No, you're not coming to rescue. People in Africa are not stupid. But there's that need to have a collaborative mindset between those at home and those in the diaspora. They can work together to creating a better Africa, to creating a better Nigeria, to creating a better Ghana, to creating a better Libya, or as the case may be. So the issue of collaboration is very important. What I've discovered is what I call tough protection. People want to protect their turf. I know of a story of somebody who was trying to go back to Africa, to Nigeria specifically, to see how he could assist a local university in leveraging on what he already knew while he was abroad. And the immediate reaction was that, what are you looking for? Do you want to come and share what we have here? Oh, no, we were here suffering. You have not paid your own price. That was a very sad testimony to the fact that somebody has a passion to want to give back, looking for an effort at collaboration, but all he sees is, hey, we want to have our turf protected. So there's a need also for a change in mindset that people coming from the diaspora are not coming to want to take over what you have. They are coming to see where they could be of assistance in making Africa generally a better place to live.
You know, you just literally touched on my next question, Prof. Because clearly there is a distrust, which again, you might want to ask, where is it coming from, or you know, how did we get to that place where there's the we have it all mentality and we can save you, and obviously that's causing this reactive response from the continent, like, no, you've eaten there, don't come here. And we missed the opportunity for collaboration, we missed the opportunity for growth and development. And you already probably started speaking to that how do we create this collaboration to work better? You've touched on mindset, without a doubt, but what more should we do so that there are more things? I tell my personal story. A lot of development I have done in my work has been with the diaspora. I lived in England for 8 years, and so for me, diaspora, and I was once in the diaspora, so I relate a lot with the diaspora. But then I see those in diaspora don't trust enough those at home, and those at home maybe because they don't understand some of the conditions the diaspora go through, to they have a very wrong mindset. So how do we grow this collaboration so that we can continue to push towards development, so that we can continue to work towards growing the continent in general?
Yeah, I think the issue what you touched on is a real one, right? One, there are so many people who want to go and set up, establish businesses, find ways to invest, and it's that issue of trust. Like and I've known too many people who have taken that leap and has been taken advantage of. Yeah. In a way where they say, I'm good. I'm not messing with Africa, right? And again, it's still that single story, Africa, like it's a monolith. So that means everybody in Africa is going, no, you have had experience with a person. And oftentimes, the internet has allowed us to make our communities a lot smaller, that we're able to contact and engage with people across social media, across the internet, across all various different outlets, to have more real dialogues about how do we invest, how do we begin to have real conversations. But I would say I'm really, and before I go there, there's an issue as well of, I've heard a lot of the brothers and sisters back in Africa saying it's almost as if Africa has become a paradise for everybody else who's coming in, while for those who are living on the ground, we have to figure out a way to survive, right? So as people are coming in, you want to maintain that kindness, that openness, but it's like, now you're living like a king, and I'm still living in this, and so you're benefiting from the continent in ways that I don't. And I think a lot of that comes to us having to take a real look at our governance, of our leadership, right? Of those who favor international policies, international people that are coming with businesses, versus some of the brilliance that we have already seen back in Nigeria, in Zimbabwe, in Ethiopia. Brilliant. And it's like, who's investing in these minds? And why is it that these minds feel that they have to, you talked about earlier, people see themselves living outside of the Africa. Why do they feel that they can only find opportunities outside of the continent, where everybody else is trying to get into the continent? Right? So the issue there is clearly is the leadership. Our leadership has been compromised. It's been, it's a lot of mistrust on that level, and that seeps down into other sectors. So where I like to, as a way to solve it is I always encourage people, if you're into marketing, I'm in youth development. That's my space, right? It was identifying other people within the diaspora that are doing the same work in the same field, and begin to have these dialogues, and immediately remove that aspect where we're going to be bringing millions and millions of dollars there. No, that's not a reality, because we don't even get millions of dollars here doing it, right? We have to struggle to run it and to develop it here. However, let's figure out a way to begin to collaborate and talk about ways in where these are things that we're doing to engage youth. And having this conversation with Tunde, with Chess and Slums, brilliant conversations about looking at how do we, with the intersections where economic development, workforce development, and youth development meet. Moving away from, let's focus on how do we just help a child develop and eat and engage in this, into start looking at it a lot more systematic, to say, how do we bring these different sectors together and giving my playbook and learning their playbook, and said, man, I can implement that here. And then forming those relationships where our children can now come and talk together, but our children can't come together if we're not talking to each other, right? If we're not engaging with each other. So setting that example first of us having those dialogues, of us being transparent with some of the challenges that we have, to show that it's as real as some of the challenges that you may have, but there's a lot I can learn from, a lot of my brothers and sisters on the continent, because you're able to do it in so many ways without the resources that I have here. So what are you doing that I should be learning from? And then these are things that I am doing that I can just kind of lend to you all. and having that dialogue. It's not like I just popped up in Nigeria and just began eat some jollof rice and going to the parties. No, it was 2 years of dialogue, of talking, of meeting on Zoom, of sharing programs, of showing what I'm doing and how I was able to do this. This is my org structure. This is how we go for funding here. And how do we collaborate to do this? It's real dialogue and conversations that oftentimes we just look at each other as a prize. You gonna bring me some money. And it's like, nah, let's sit down and talk through this. And I encourage people in the diaspora to really begin to connect with that. I mean, some of the brilliance, some of the work is phenomenal, and people recognize, like, man, Africa, they are doing it because there's still a hunger that we have lost, right? So they are doing it to levels that we haven't even looked at it. But how do we begin to have authentic dialogue without that exploiting each other?
Professor, that was profound. And I love the way you broke it down. You know, you identify your space, the people in that space, and start to have the dialogue. And there must be mutual respect. Nobody's a prize you want to take from. You know, it's about we want to give, we want to learn, and that's a mutual respect. Thank you for sharing that. Professor Kumolalo, do you have any thoughts to add on that?
Yeah, and this will sound a bit controversial. I think Africa has ceded the media space for what I would call malevolent forces. In my opinion, this is the controversy. The rule guiding social network in Africa should not be the same as Europe or the Americas. Why? We're in different stages of development. And there's a need for mobilization of the citizenry to think right and then to do right. But if the space has been ceded to, let's see how things go, everybody has freedom of speech, I can say anything, whatever I think I can say, I think it's rather counterproductive. And as such, there is a need to actually socially engineer Africans, young Africans, to think about themselves, to think about the homeland, to think about the engagement of the homeland with the world, to think of opportunities on the continent, to think of exploring and maximizing the knowledge out there elsewhere in the world. And if the space is just anything goes as it is today, because that's what obtains elsewhere in the world, I don't think it works maximally to the advantage of African.
Prof, that is, I'm sure many people would also, and I love the fact you gave us the one in, controversial, because we live in a global world, and when you say you want to put certain rules, it's almost like the climate change conversation where many of the Western countries built their industries with coal and all these gases, and then they tell Africa that isn't as developed not to use those emitting gases, but that was how you built, But then the converse side of that is, well, now we know it's bad. Are we going to allow you to continue to do that? But at what cost to Africa? At what cost to the continent? And I think these are definitely no fast answers to it, especially when the rules are not being created by the African states. So you play by the rule book of those that are creating the rules, and everything economic, everything is tied to that, and that makes for an interesting conversation. But thank you for sharing that, Prof. I'm going to ask the question because really that is one the title. We've talked about reclaiming roots, shaping futures. What to you, professors, both of you, I'll let you have your go, and before I open the floor to the audience, what is the African diaspora's role in nation building for you? Looking at the future, what is the role of the African diaspora in building nations across the continent?
I think the first step is to understand the continent. The first step is to understand that when we speak of Africa, we're talking about how many languages, We talk about how many different governments. We're talking about how many different, set cultures, within it. And sometimes there may be a level of ignorance of looking at Africa through one lens, right? And then the same damage on the other side, and where you tend to look at African Americans through one lens, or look at the diaspora through a certain lens. So I think the first step is to really understand what you're trying to build. And I think the second step is to really begin to understand some of the governmental structures and having these dialogues. I'm always reminded, well, we can't do that here. Right? Like what you do there and this and how you go about this, that's not what we can do here. Right. So not coming to a space knowing that we can build the perfect model like this without understanding the limitations and some of the obstacles that are there. The saying goes that a lot of the wealth, they're exporting their children into the West and other places to experience life, whereas the poor kids of Africa end up becoming street kids. So what happens to the middle? Like any organization, anybody that doesn't have a plan for the future, anybody that doesn't have a youth development plan, a country that doesn't have one doesn't exist within the next 10, 15, 30 years, right? So the first step is understanding what are the limitations. While there are so much things you want to do, so much things you want to share, you need to also understand that there are parameters and there are levels to it. There are certain places you can't go, you can't touch on. So I would say, well, do you now begin to build that type of nation building with some of your counterparts? But do they really have the power to institute? Do they really have the power to move policies that can make a difference? Is there a check and balance structure where the money that's going in is not going to somebody's bank somewhere in Switzerland, right? But it's actually going to build, it's actually going into an engagement. So I think it begins with really start talking about what are real policies around youth development, what are real policies around economic development. Look at things like can we implement a 1 cent tax in a way that can go into this fund, and then who manages the fund, right? And the fund shouldn't be managed by some NGO outside. But at the same time, if it's managed by somebody within, how are there checks and balances in place? Because the last thing you want to do is to start pouring and you just end up saying, okay, I'm done. Right. So I think there's a big role in investment and connecting with the diaspora, with the continent in nation building. But, we got to first understand, what do we even know about nation building? How does it even works? Right. In a real way. So I think it's a great deal of education where there are people in the business sector that understands the financial systems and how to maneuver and how to work through a lot of the banks, right? And how to get resources in. But the question becomes, how do you get the resources in and where it can actually do what it is supposed to do? Africa has everything it needs to be the leader in going forward. But do we have the right leadership in place to make it happen?
Wow. Always comes to leadership, eh? As you were speaking and you talked about the youth policy, I just remembered Africa has the youngest continent, youngest population across the world. And that's a fact. And that's just, what are you going to do with that?
What's the plan?
It could work for you or it could work against you. What is your plan? And that is so vital. All right.
Real quick, I'm sorry. What's the plan? Not just in one country, but across. What's the youth development dialogue across Africa? Are the young people across the continent talking to each other and building the vision? If we see that the elders are really worrying about lining their pockets, right? Are the young people talking to each other in a way that they can now begin to bring the diaspora into the conversations, and we can all talk about ways of rising, but being careful that we're not allowing outside interests, right? Interests. We understand those outside interests that comes in through all kinds of NGOs to talk about this policy and that policy that will tell you I can only give money if you do this, right? Be careful of those kind of interests. But people across talking to each other. And I think that's where it can begin.
And money is always a powerful driver. Yes, sir. I'll let you go next.
What the prof says. I'll use 3 keywords: window of opportunity, identity, and commitment. Africa has the youngest population in the world today. What a huge advantage Africa has. No other continent has today what Africa has. I mean, there's no continent that should be to compete with Africa. You know, I have a favorite book. It says that the beauty of young people is their strength.
That's right.
And so Africa has a bank, if you would, of strong people, strong mentally, strong physically. That's one. Identity. Now, speaking about the diaspora engaging with Africa, which Africa will they engage with? Old people? Those who are on their way out? Or middle-aged people who kind of give up on their own dreams? Or this huge reservoir, I call it the African powerhouse. And then the issue of commitment. You know, if you just come back into the diaspora, people in the diaspora who have African origin, do they really identify with the continent? Except for a few, like my brother here, who seem to be, excuse my language, crazy about Africa. Many African diasporians don't care about the continent. Even those who are just a generation away from Africa, they want to identify more as British or as German or as American, and not quite an African diasporian. And when we look again back to India, Indians in diaspora have been able to sustain their Indian identity. It makes it easier for Indians in the diaspora to reconnect with the homeland. And I think Africa has that major problem in creating an enduring identity in the diaspora that will want to engage with Africa and engage with the proper Africa, with the useful Africa, with the Africa that has a vision, with the Africa that has some dream for the future, not an expiring Africa.
Wow. Well, you know, for me, so I speak as an African in Africa, and I see the role of the diaspora is there's and maybe because there's a lot of foundational work still to be done, which hopefully conversations like this will continue to prop up and give us the platform to speak. It's easier to fly to London than to fly to Cape Verde or Cape Verde. It's easier to fly to the United States than it is for me to fly to many other African countries. In fact, if you're going to some countries, you go to Europe first before you can get a flight back into Africa.
Really?
And yes. Oh, yes. So these are challenges. So Professor LaRoche was talking about having dialogues. We can't even fly to each other necessarily. And for me, I feel that, yes, there are some markets that generally Africans in Africa are not even looking at. They're hoping for foreign direct investment. They're not looking at those markets. They're heavily capital intensive, but we have African diaspora in those industries, in those areas, in those sectors, but some are not even looking back. You know, so when you talk about the role of and I know, yes, there's several reasons, right? We've already discussed that: security, government, leadership. I know all of that, but I just feel that if there is a will, there will be a way, and I really do feel that you know, if you come into for example, construction, there's so many people playing construction. But if you come into airports, there are not many people playing in airports, for example. If you come into certain things, there are not many people playing there. And so I actually like to see the diaspora with the experience, with a lot of things they do so well. The Gatwick Airport is owned by a Nigerian. I hear a lot of things, and I just keep wondering, well, I know there's the commerce side as well. Are they going to put their money where they're not sure of returns? And there's so much to do, but we want to see more. And we hope this sort of platforms will make those conversations continue to happen. I really must open the floor because I'm sure there are people itching to ask questions, and I really don't want to continue to hold them back. So we would have the questions come up on the screen. If they are targeted, then Professor LaRoche or Professor Kumolalo would answer. And if they're not, then either one of you or both of you might want to answer it, depending on how you want to take it. So we'll have the questions start to come up on the screen, and then we'll just take it from there. All right. So how do we create systems for knowledge exchange between home and abroad? And that's emoji A. And any one of you wants to take that? Create systems for knowledge exchange. So if we keep talking about brain drain, how do we make it brain gain? How do we ensure there is an exchange? And I love what Professor LaRoche said. You said you identify your space. So how do we ensure that in your space you're having those conversations, you're sharing knowledge? Who initiates that conversation? Is it Africa? Is it the diaspora? Who does it? And how do we create those systems?
So when we use the word system, right, that is, we're talking structure, we're talking industry, we're talking macro. Right. So when we're talking about just dialogues, conversations, then we're talking about programs like cultural exploration, where I have brothers from Tanzania, a brother from Nigeria leading that with African American youth. Right. This is an exchange of dialogue on a awakening, changing how people have been programmed to see things. When we're talking about systems of information, we're talking one of my brothers, I'm gonna shout out to him. He just did a big event down in the Congo. My brother Danny, he's a Congolese living in the Texas area, went back, put together a conference in where he's bringing a lot of the new tech, a lot of the AI, people that are doing phenomenal things in that space, and he's bringing that to the Congo and to the universities, some of the schools there, to get some of those systems of exchange, the dialogue, to start having those conferences, right? When we have our conference here, we brought forth Tunde from Nigeria to lead the conference, so there can be that dialogue of exchange, and in these spaces we can begin to open up more doors for opportunities where someone may be interested in artificial intelligence, in robotics, in whatever field, and they're able to make that proper contact. So it's about creating the spaces first, identifying, can we have an international, it's already happening. What are some of those international conference? There's a conference going on in Houston next month called Afrotech, with the major companies like Amazon and major different industries from not just America, but also across Africa that are already there. So it's out there. It's just about how do we become more aware of it? So I think the bigger question becomes, where is that information where we're able to share what are some of the things that are happening, that are taking place, so that younger people or people of interest, people on the diaspora, in diaspora that wants to invest in programs like this as well, dialogues like this, but what are some of the spaces that already exist where there is that dialogue, that exchange of information is taking place, and how do we take part of that? And then how do we also branch that forward? Like my brother Daniel, who went back to the Congo and led his tech conference there, and to really engage the young people. So it's happening. It's just, how do we become aware of that? Is there Facebook? Is there Instagram? Is there a social media page that could bring us to that awareness, and then we can grow from there?
Absolutely. I totally agree. Professor Kumolalo.
Yeah, to build on that, part of the systems will be active and useful keywords. Collaboration between universities.
Yeah.
In the diaspora and back home in Africa.
Yeah.
Not just signing MOUs for the sake of MOUs, but useful and active collaboration where using knowledge. I mean, I'm not talking about AI. The truth is, we don't have an idea of the depth and the width of AI. And if our universities wouldn't be on the forefront of now trying to leverage their structure, at least those who are in college, if by the time you are graduating, you are not like me. I mean, as a graduate with a master's degree, I had no clue what they call PowerPoint. I was that ignorant. So that when I first started graduating, they actually can engage meaningfully with their world. And it will give African young people, the African powerhouse, a leg up in engaging with the world. If our universities back home in Africa can, if you would, get up their high horse to learn from their counterparts elsewhere in the world, to take the advantage of best practices and best knowledge in Europe, in the Americas, and have it in a manner that will be useful locally to the African situation.
That's profound, Prof. The AI you mentioned, or what both of you mentioned, is such a leveler. If Africa could tap into it, it would literally bring us very quickly to a standard where but in many parts of Africa, people are not even talking about it, and I think that's a shame, and also talks to why we must create these systems of exchange. And to the point of the information center, I think that's always the issue. Even when diaspora wants to invest in Africa, where do they go? How do we know who to invest in? How do we know? Do we limit it to the embassies? How do we know? Where's the general information? And these are things that I think are opportunities for both sides to really work together. Okay, we'll take the next.
To interrupt you, my brother spoke a while ago about leadership.
Yes,
it boils down to the issue of leadership. For instance, the sub-regional leaders in Africa, state governors in a place like Nigeria, what are they doing to actually collaborate, to engage with the outside world, so as to again look at the powerhouse over whom they sit as leaders?
Yeah, I agree. If I could say one more, it's that's 100%, because we can put all the investments in the world in youth and technology and AI, but if the leadership don't have a vision, if the leadership is not looking to enrich the people, then what are we doing? There are brilliant African Union students groups all across universities, brothers and sisters from Nigeria and Ghana and Ethiopia and everywhere, brilliant, doing some phenomenal work, who want to come back home and do stuff. And majority of them are saying the same thing. It's not an infrastructure where I can actually develop. I need to develop something here, raise some capital, then potentially go back home and try to help my family. Versus, how you follow where I'm coming from? It's when the leadership doesn't invest in its people, this is what we end up with.
Sure. Professor Kumolalo spoke a lot about India, and if you think about Singapore and many other countries, they were very strategic. The leadership was very strategic, investing in its people, taking them to the West, learning and bringing them back home to do things. And that's visionary leadership. All right, we'll take the next question. I did, envisage it would be a lot of good conversation, and I hope you're all enjoying it. So African governments must put in place policies. Okay, so that's for Professor Kumolalo. I think you were talking about African governments putting in place policies. They want you to further expatiate on that, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just trying to underscore the need for governments in Africa to think clearly, to think purposefully, and to think big, and to put in place policies that will make it not easy, but it's easier for those in the diaspora to engage with folks back home. Oftentimes, when it comes to visioneering, our leaders, they plan for 3 years, for 5 years, for 2 years. That would only help on the long run. For instance, the example Mara gave earlier on, Ghana was able to put in place the year of return. It didn't happen overnight.
No.
It took planning. It took being intentional. That's an example of a good policy that is working. Of 54 African governments, if only one would do something like that in 10, 20 years, that is sad. So the idea is that government or those who lead us must be intentional in trying to engage the diaspora by putting in place policies that will either incentivize, attract, encourage, or at the minimum, take out the hurdles. So those who want to come back to Africa can actually have a place to come back to engage, to invest, to learn.
And so, for example, maybe just to shed more light on that, the Nigerian government has the NIDCOM, which is the Nigerian Diaspora Commission, and it does do a lot of work with diaspora. I also know that some governments have one-stop shops, so that you know, if you come in as diaspora or whatever, there is a one-stop shop where you can get as much information as you can and just really decentralize, or if you like, centralize, I beg your pardon, all the information you need. So you're not having to go to several places. You have one-stop shop to help you get, if you're going to need land and you're going to need other resources, then you can easily get that and not have to deal with so many bottlenecks along the way. All right.
Let me just interrupt you. The Nigerian NIDCOM, I think, is doing a good job in assisting circular immigrants. Those who travel the back, they got into trouble abroad. Those are very good things to do. But I don't think, and with all respect to Mrs. Dabiri, doing a great job, but there should be either a unit or a department focused essentially on long-term planning in engaging the diaspora.
Well, so I mean, I don't speak for NIDCOM, and I don't know much about what they're doing, but I do know that they've started to think more economically. So I hear things like, you know, bonds for development and you know, just trying to get more, because obviously we did speak in the last webinar about remittances being higher than what we get from oil and so on and so forth. So the diaspora has a key role in nation building, and it's just how we utilize them. First of all, the data speaks for itself. When you have the data, then you can start to plan and leverage that to you know, to do more. So yes, I think, well, Nigeria has, more African countries also should have, but then they must restructure themselves so that it's not just short-term gains. They're more long-term, ambitious plans the diaspora can get involved with. All right, next question, please. I did promise our professors we will be out of here be within the next 10 minutes, so we'll just take that quickly. Professor LaRoche, this is for you. How can African governments effectively engage with the diaspora to tap into their resources and expertise?
I think that was pretty much spelled out. Professor Kilmona really addressed that. The role of the government, I mean, there are different units, there are different committees that can be established that can welcome, as far as the different sectors back in to do various different presentations. But it's, I think my issue is there is always a lot of talk about what could be done, right? But then when do we actually begin to do it, right? There may be a level of expertise that's coming from the diaspora, but as we're talking about creating opportunities where there is land, where people want to come and bring different businesses, people want to come and do workshops and engage different departments with artificial intelligence, robotics, various different sectors. while we're talking about that, there's also home, that kind of brilliance that already exists. And I think this is what I believe causes a lot of the rift, where there is that investment that is coming from somebody outside, where there is people inside that have ideas. This young brother talked about a way to solve an issue with blindness using virtual reality. In Nigeria, who's investing in him? Where is the economic engine, the mentors, the business sectors within Africa that can mentor this young man to help invest in his or her idea that could spread out? So I believe that from a diaspora expertise, we can bring a lot of stuff there. We can do workshops, do collaborative conferences, and run conferences and engage in conferences. But I think it goes into the next step where we say, okay, like Zimbabwe did at one point, okay, if we're going to, how do we pair an expert on this side in diaspora with an expert on the ground and allow them a space for up to 2 weeks to, with their teams, to think through issues, to develop, to have these dialogues. So it's not an expert coming in and an expert leaving, but an expert working together with an expert that is already on the ground. So creating the space where those dialogues can happen, but in a way that it's not a, I get it, I would get paid to go and do it, then I would get that money and go right back to the States and you spend it here, right? But how do we do it in a way where there is, those experts can align and begin to work together in a real way, and begin to look at investments on this side in Africa, as well as investments from the States? Because as long as there's investments only coming from the States, then somebody's going to try to dictate, one is going to dictate the other, right? So matching investments, matching expertise, creating a space where we're not just meeting for a day or two, but a week, 2-week conference to identify these issues and coming up with solutions. And there's a space to do it, where there's investments on both sides that can go into seeing it through. Other than that, it's just going to be more talk about what we can do and not a lot of action of what's actually being done.
Fantastic. And in fairness, you know, we must also put into cognizance technology. You know, before you had to fly everywhere, but with technology, you know, we can have more dialogues, more conversations, just like we're having now, and that's the starting point. Before even you want to go travel to Zambia or Kenya or anywhere, you start those conversations. And Professor LaRoche has said so much about the work he's doing, plus Chasing Slums, where he's also part and parcel of. So I think that has really brought us to the end of our conversation today. I don't see any more questions. What I do see is a lot of comments. Thank you all for your comments. I've always seen the diaspora, and I always get the sense that people sometimes feel the diaspora is no longer part of us, and I see that a lot from the continent, and it's there's a danger in that sort of thinking. It becomes a we versus them. You know, the diaspora, as far as I'm concerned, if you call Africa the headquarters, we send them to different branches, and then they come back home, you know, to HQ. But then they're still connected. They're still connected as long as they want to be. They're still connected, and we must continue to see African remittance or diaspora remittance not like, oh, it's some foreigners. It's your brothers and sisters out there that are working very hard to be able to put things back into the continent. So on behalf of the African Governance Institute for Development, I really sincerely want to thank Professor Frederick Kumolalo and Professor Leif LaRoche for your time, for being so gracious. It's really the middle of the day in the United States, but both of you have found time to create time for us to have this conversation. We are grateful, and we really want to thank you for the work you do. You are nation builders, you're continent builder, and the work you do inspires us here at the African Governance Institute for Development. And we really want to say thank you all for being here. For those of you joining for the first time, please do The replay will be online on our YouTube channel. You can check the Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn channel, and a survey will be sent to your emails tomorrow as well, so that you can tell us how we can continue to improve and serve you better. But on behalf of the team, I really want to say thank you once again, everyone, for joining. Professor LaRoche, Professor Kumolalo, thank you for being here. And until we meet in the second week of November, I wish us all the very best. The survey is in the chat box. You can fill that as you leave. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you. This is the African Governance Institute for Development. Bye for now.